Welcome to Chapter 6, Business Formation and Choosing the Form that Fits. Have you ever thought about the type of business that you would like to set up? Do you think you'd like to be a sole owner, or would you rather have partners? Or would you rather work for a company, a large corporation? We're going to spend time in this chapter reviewing the different forms of businesses and corporations that are out there, and hopefully that gives you some ideas about finding a form that fits. So we're going to be looking at the characteristics of the four basic forms of business ownership. We'll take a look at the advantages and disadvantages of a sole proprietorship, and then evaluate the pros and cons of the partnership as a form of business ownership. We'll explain why corporations have become the dominant form of business ownership, especially here in the United States. I'll explain why limited liability companies are becoming an increasingly popular form of business ownership. And finally, we'll evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of franchising. Now, a sole proprietorship, that is where there is a single owner that actively manages the company. And essentially in a sole proprietorship, the company earnings are given the same treatment as the owner's income. And the debts that are incurred are also treated as the owner's debt. Now, in partnership, partnerships have two or more people that act as co-owners of a business for profit. And generally, most partners actively engage in managing the business, and they have unlimited liability for any claims that are made against the firm should there be legal action taken against them. There's also corporations, and corporations are considered to be a legal entity that is separate and distinct from its owners. And in order for a company to be considered a corporation, they have to file articles of incorporation. And these are filed with the state government, and there's a formal process to establish the existence of this new corporation. Corporations are almost like artificial people because they can lawfully participate in all business activities that a natural person can participate in, but there aren't the same liabilities. If a company is sued, it's very different from going after an individual. Now, limited liabilities, these are also considered to be organizations that are separate from their owners, in that, again, the person that maybe is running the company is not personally held liable for any claims made against the firm. And the owner may lose the investment that they've made in the company, but their personal assets, their home, their retirement that they have that is separate, those assets are protected. So something that's nice about a limited liability company is that it offers limited liability to its owners, and there's some flexible tax treatment. So let's take a look at some of the pros and cons of each of these different business types. So for a sole proprietor, some advantages are that it's easy to go into business. You have total control. There's definitely a sense of ownership that gives you some pride. You're able to keep all of the profits, and there's possibly some tax advantages. Now, some disadvantages to being the sole proprietor is that you have limited resource options. You're putting yourself a little bit on the line should something go on, something happen like an accident. You could lose your home or some of your personal assets. You have a limited ability to attract and maintain talent because most people are either wanting to move up in the corporate ladder or they want to own the company themselves. So you're not able to attract and maintain that type of talent. Usually it's a lot of work, there's a lot of responsibilities, and there's definitely a lack of permanence. So the chance of being successful is very, very hard. A lot of people think that it's pretty easy to run your own business, but it's not. It's a lot of work and it's very, very rewarding. I don't want to sound like a doom and gloomer, but you really have to put everything on the line. Now, in the formation of general partnerships, you can have as many partners as you like. Typically, there's verbal and or written agreements that give, the details regarding how much each party contributed to the company, what their specific duties and responsibilities are, how the profits and losses will be shared amongst the partners, how disagreements will be settled if disagreements happen, if a big one happens. And what happens if a partner dies or if a partner wants to withdraw from the partnership? So it is usually best to have these agreements written out versus having a verbal agreement, because when it's the details are written out, that helps everybody to be on the same page and can help to resolve disagreements down the road. Now, some advantages of a general partnership. You have the ability to pool financial resources. You can share the responsibilities of the business. You can capitalize on complementary skills. So you wouldn't want a partner that is exactly like you. You want someone that is maybe stronger in some areas than you are. They're very easy to form, and there are certainly tax advantages. So some disadvantages are unlimited liability. There's the potential for disagreements with your partners. There can be a lack of continuity in terms of personal style. And it can be difficult to withdraw from a partnership depending on, the state of the company. If the company is going through difficult times and you want to bail, your partner might not want you to bail right then. So those are just some things to be considerate of or to consider. Now, some other forms of partnership. We have the limited partnership, where there's general partners and they participate fully in the company, but they assume unlimited personal liability. So that can be a risk. And in limited partners, they also cannot actively participate and are protected by limited liability. So there's a couple of different types of limited partnerships, your general partners and your limited partners. Now, a limited liability partnership, all partners participate in the management of the company, and they have a limited liability for the company's debts. So if a company begins to struggle and is close to bankruptcy or going out of business, that is where there's protection, where your personal assets are protected. And that can be a huge advantage when you're setting up a firm. Now, corporations. There are several different types of corporations. A C corporation is a legal business entity that offers limited liability to all of its owners. So corporations are they're managed by corporate bylaws, and these bylaws have rules for how the company is set up. There are rules for how it conducts its business, and there are guidelines that the corporation must follow. So a business entity that works towards being a corporation not only has to file those articles of incorporation, but they get to pay filing fees. And we've already talked about adopting their corporate bylaws. Forming a corporation requires more financing, and it is more costly than forming a sole proprietorship or a partnership. Now, common stock represents the basic ownership interest in a corporation, and some firms issue something called preferred stock, and others issue what's called common stock. And the difference is with preferred stock, an individual owns a part of the company, but they have no say in the direction that the company is going in. So you have a part ownership, but you're kind of a silent partner. Whereas if you own common stock, then you have voting rights. And once a year, you will receive the number of votes that is equivalent to the number of shares that you own. With a corporation, there is always a board of directors, and these individuals are elected by the stockholders to represent their interests. They are voted on. Usually a board of directors will serve a term of anywhere from 2 to 4 years, depending on the corporation. And these terms overlap each other so that you have some board members coming in while some are staying, and that way you have consistency amongst your board. Now, some advantages and disadvantages of C corporations. A big advantage is that there's limited liability. If the corporation goes under, then as a stockholder, you are not responsible for that company's liability. Usually these companies are very established and there's a lot of permanence. It is easy to transfer ownership. It's very simple to buy and sell stock. You're able to raise large amounts of financial capital, and that is done through the purchase of stock or the selling of stock. And you're also able to make use of specialized management. So you're using a team that is, each person is highly skilled in their area of expertise. For example, you'll have an accountant, so someone to oversee the finances. You have someone who's vice president of marketing because they're great at getting the message out, and so on and so forth. Some disadvantages of the C corporation: they can be very expensive and to set up, and the complexity of forming them and figuring out how to operate them, it can be quite a project. So sometimes that's enough to keep people from doing it. There can be complications when operating in more than one state because states have different rules and regulations. There can be double taxation of earnings and additional corporate taxes. There's more paperwork, there's more regulation, and less secrecy. So when you become a publicly traded company, stockholders have the right to information. And it is possible to have some conflicts of interest when you are um, working or trying to set up a corporation. So some advantages of an S corporation or a statutory close corporation is that the IRS does not tax earnings separately. So you're able to avoid the problem of double taxation, and your stockholders also have limited liability. Some limitations of an S corporation: you cannot have any more than 100 stockholders, and each stockholder must be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. So a statutory close or closed corporation operate under simpler arrangements than conventional corporations, and all owners are able to participate in the management of that corporation, but they still have limited liability should something go wrong. And similar to the S corporation, the number of stockholders is limited, and shares cannot be sold without first offering those shares to existing owners. And not all states allow for this type of formation. So if you were thinking about starting a statutory close corporation, then you might need to find out if you're living in a state that allows those types of organizations. And finally, nonprofits. So nonprofits, some great advantages of these corporations is that they're exempt from federal and state income taxes, and the members and directors have limited liability. And individuals who contribute money or property to the nonprofit can take a tax deduction, which makes it easier for these organizations to raise funds from donations. An example is the Oregon Food Bank, which is a huge nonprofit in the state of Oregon. And people can make donations or contributions to the food bank, and that helps the food bank to raise the funds they need to purchase food and then distribute it to the needy. So some limitations of the nonprofit: you can have members of a nonprofit, but you cannot have stockholders. You cannot distribute dividends to members, and dividends are a type of similar to earning interest in a bank account. That's the quickest way to describe it right now. Nonprofits cannot contribute funds to a political campaign, and you have to keep accurate records and file paperwork to document your tax-exempt status. And there's different paperwork for nonprofits than there are for other corporations. Now, corporate restructuring happens under two different scenarios. The one scenario is an acquisition, which is where a firm acquires or buys another firm. And these acquisitions can be friendly, where one company welcomes the opportunity to be purchased, and they can be hostile, where a company does not want to be taken over. So once it is acquired, the one company ceases to exist. An example of an acquisition, I'm trying to think of one. Acquisitions are different from mergers. I can think of a merger right away. So a merger is two formerly independent business companies that combine to form a new organization. So a merger in recent history is United Airlines and Continental Airlines. The two corporations, their upper management, got together and decided to combine, and The stockholders approved that merger. The government approved it, and that was a happy business arrangement. So there's a couple of different types of mergers and acquisitions. We have a horizontal merger where there's a combination of firms in the same industry, and that reason that companies would do that is to get bigger and to become a bigger player in the market. You can also improve efficiencies in terms of getting rid of duplicate facilities. If you have two people doing the same job, you can streamline that. So instead of two people, you have one. Let's see, the example I just gave you of United Airlines and Continental would be an example of a horizontal merger. A vertical merger is a combination of firms that are at different stage in the production of a good or service, creating a buyer-seller relationship. So this typically happens to provide more integration of production and increased control over the supply of crucial inputs. For example, the food conglomerate ConAgra which is based in Omaha, they own a lot of farms and cattle ranches. And so when they are meeting or producing their own, Hebrew National is one of their hot dog brands. So they will use cattle that they have raised, and that gives them a better opportunity to control the price of cattle as they are working to, sell a product. A conglomerate merger is a combination of firms in unrelated industries. So you might have so Dish, for example, has initially they offered satellite TV reception, but they have gotten into the business of providing internet, of providing streaming. So they have expanded by combining and purchasing firms from different industries. And they've done that by reducing the risk of they've done this to make the firm less vulnerable to adverse conditions in any single market. So as satellite TV becomes more, it's really, consumers right now are kind of walking away from satellite TV, but Dish, because they are marketing products, different types of products to consumers, they should be able to withstand some of those changes or shifts in their business a little easier than if they were still relying on purely satellite TV. Now, divestiture. This is the transfer of either total or partial ownership of the firm's operations to investors or to another company. And firms will use divestiture when a part of their company no longer fits into their strategic plans. An example of this is ConAgra Foods used to own a firm called Wilbur Ellis, and Wilbur Ellis provides herbicides and pesticides to farmers and nursery people. And they decided about 10 years ago that really didn't fit with their corporate idea. So they've sold off or divested Wilbur Ellis, who still continues to exist, but it is independent. Now, a spin-off happens when a company issues stock in one of its own divisions and sets it up as a separate company. So after the spin-off, stockholders will own two different companies. A spin-off doesn't create additional funds for the owners, but it does give them a chance to own, your personal wealth can possibly grow. So US Bank used to own Piper Jaffe, which is an investment firm. And US Bank decided maybe 15 years ago that that company didn't fit with where they saw their banking business going. So they've spun it off, and now Piper Jaffe has their own stock that stockholders own. Finally, we have the Carve Out Company, or the Carve Out, which is a company that sells the stock to outside investors. And what this does is it raises additional capital. So firms will usually sell a minority of their total share, and they're able to get some financial capital that they need, but they're also able to maintain their ownership, so they're not giving up too much. Now, the limited liability company, which we talked about briefly a few slides ago, it's formed by filing a document, and there are fees that are paid to the respective state that it will operate in. The limited liability organizers will draft an operating agreement, and it's not a corporation and it's not a partnership. So the owners are called members, and they manage their company under an agreement. And they also will hire professional managers to run their company. It's very similar to the filing of the bylaws as far as these rules that corporations operate under, but some states will allow them, some states won't, and you have to just take a look at whether or not the state you want to run your business in, whether or not they'll do it. Some advantages of an LLC: there's limited liability, there's tax pass-through, so none of the double taxation that corporations incur. They're pretty simple and flexible in terms of their management and operation, and ownership is also very flexible. Disadvantage: it's pretty complex to put one together. There's an annual franchise tax that you have to pay. And if you're doing business in other states, they will consider you, give you foreign status, as if you were a company that was operating overseas, and there may be some unfair tax advantages. And there's limits on the types of firms that can form under an LLC, and these differences, you have to really look into each law or each state to see what that state's laws are regarding LLCs. Now, a franchise, this is a company that has a licensing agreement that allows a franchisee to use its name, trademark, products, business methods, and other property. The franchisor is the part of the company who supplies the resources in exchange for money and other considerations. So one of the most common franchises that I'm sure you're all familiar with, we have McDonald's and KFC. So McDonald's as a company will allow a person to open up a McDonald's store, but they're going to have to pay for the right to use the resources that are provided by McDonald's. There are guidelines in terms of uniform, signage, the menu. There are rules and regulations for production. So while you're purchasing a business and you're running your own business, you also have rules and regulations that you have to follow, or the franchise company can cancel your contract. Now, some advantages of having a franchise: there's less risk because there's usually, a well-known name. There's training and support, you have brand recognition, and it's easier to access some funding. Some disadvantages: it can be very, very expensive to purchase the licensing agreement in a franchise. You do have a lack of control because you have to follow the company's rules for management. You can have a negative halo effect. So if a company has something bad happen in one of its franchisee stores across the state, your business can be impacted by that, even though your business practices are outstanding. There can be growth challenges. There can be restrictions on the sale of your product, and there can be poor marketing and other business decisions that are done at corporate that you may not have any control over. So they're pretty cool, and there's some risks involved also. So in a franchise agreement, what you will find is a contractual arrangement that will outline the responsibilities of everybody that's involved. You have your terms and conditions that the company is going to operate under. You have a fee schedule and other payment schedule. The franchise will provide training and support for both the owner and the managers, but also the employees. And there are usually very specific operational requirements, so that in the example of McDonald's, when you go to McDonald's in Gresham, Oregon, you should have the same experience in Medford, Oregon at a McDonald's. They are that consistent. There are terms of conflict resolution. So if you're having a disagreement with the franchisor, then there's a way to resolve that. And there's also typically an assigned territory. So you're able to open up stores within a certain geographical area. Now, the Federal Trade Commission oversees franchises, and they make it mandatory for franchisors to provide their potential franchisees with the franchise disclosure document. And this document covers 23 separate major topics. But within this document, you have lots of details that describe many, many aspects of running this business. And it needs to be given to you at least 14 calendar days before you sign it. And the reason for that timing is it's legally binding, and before you sign a contract, you need to understand it. And because of their details, you need time to process that information. Legalese is a challenge sometimes to read. So looking back, we've looked at the 4 basic types of business ownership, and we've discussed the pros and cons of owning a sole proprietorship, the pros and cons of a partnership as a form of owning a business. We've looked at why corporations have become the dominant form of business ownership. And we've looked at limited liability companies and how they're becoming an increasingly popular form of business ownership. And we've also spent a little bit of time evaluating and looking at the advantages and disadvantages of franchising. So this concludes our lecture for Chapter 6. There is a quiz, and please make sure that you are looking in Buzz to find any other assignments that may be associated with this chapter. Have a super day, and please contact me if you have any questions. Thank you.